Let's start. Let's start again. I know that people are still gossiping and talking, right? Practicing actually the topic of the talk before. So, and now we will go for another one, for another plenary talk, and it's my great pleasure to invite Justin Mogilsky, who is assistant professor at the University of South Carolina in the United States. And he does lots of interesting research on decision making and many other things. But the research I know better from him is about consensually non-monogamous relationships. So he's actually a leader of a great international team of researchers who are collaborating on this topic, and actually we are one of those, right? So so it is actually really great to see him over here, and we are looking forward to his talk. So it's your turn. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. All right, thank you all for being here. So, as Jarkko mentioned, my name is Dr. Justin Mogilsky. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at the University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie. As I've learned from, I think, the anthropologists at this conference, it's that when you are trying to make an argument or trying to describe something, it's probably helpful to give some background and give some context for it. So I want to describe my background, and I think that will help everyone understand how I've gotten onto the topic of consensual non-monogamy from the history of research that I've done. So I was raised in Pennsylvania in the United States. I got my master's from Bucknell University working with Dr. T. Joel Wade, who's an experimental social psychologist. I got my PhD from Oakland University, where I worked with, my advisor was Dr. Lisa Welling, but Oakland's a bit of a hive mind, and so I ended up working with people like Todd Shackelford as well, who's many people probably know. Virgil Ziegler-Hill, who's a personality psychologist, so I was trained in some personality science. Jennifer Vonk, who's a comparative cognitivist, so some of that work as well. And what I've published on is actually a variety of topics, including one of my earliest works was on mate poaching, which mate poaching is, rather than, if you are looking for a relationship, going after someone who's single, attempting to get into a relationship with someone who is currently in a relationship. I've looked at infidelity more broadly and preferences for a partner's fidelity within a relationship. Cross-gender friendships. When I was getting my PhD, I also looked at morphometric cues of partner attractiveness, things like facial attractiveness, body attractiveness, and the things that we pay attention to while looking at people's faces. I've developed the use of something called conjoint analysis in the study of mate preferences and how people make trade-offs in the traits that they're looking for in a potential mate. And then more recently, and where I've kind of stuck, is consensual non-monogamy. And so I want to answer why. Why is this such a, I think, an important topic for evolutionary psychologists in particular, or evolutionary scientists more broadly, why they should be focusing on these kinds of relationships. How did I start with everything? Well, I was curious. And the other part of it was, a little bit higher? Sure, you are. I was curious, and the other part of it is that long ago I was a mate poacher. When I told my wife that I'd be introducing myself as a mate poacher at this talk, she looked at me and she said, I'm not sure if you want to do that. I disagree. I actually think that of the many topics that we can talk about, the things that we consider perhaps a little bit more immoral, things that we suspect may be exploitative, that are harmful to people, those are the things to talk about. And it happens, and we need to understand why. The other thing is I think the experience of mate poaching is poorly understood, and that when I was getting into relationships and being a mate poacher, what that experience was like to me was, well, I found some people attractive, and I happened to notice that, well, their relationship maybe wasn't as high of quality as they wanted. They enjoyed spending time with me. I enjoyed spending time with them. So it was not exploitative. I wasn't looking to manipulate them. It was just that it clicked, and that was the circumstance. And so one of the first studies that I published on was looking at how friendship, being friends with someone might be a strategy for forming a relationship with someone who is in a relationship themselves. And so we experimentally manipulated vignettes, some stories, presented them to people, and we asked them how successful, how satisfying a relationship would be if, for example, you were friends with someone before you ended up mate poaching them, and how effective that would be. The other big question that I had was, well, is poaching really immoral? If this is something that people are doing with some frequency, and I think that you can poach without having nefarious intent, without intending to exploit others, really what makes that so harmful? And I started looking at pathological personality traits or dark personality traits, willingness to exploit others for personal gain. And in a later study that I did with some colleagues, we found that mate poaching is not something that is just a uniform practice. There are varieties of intensity, of harm that can be inflicted, and it seems that people who are relatively higher on this willingness to exploit others are those who are mate poaching in a way that's more aggressive, that tends to be more unpleasant for those involved, etc. I also related this to staying friends with an ex, the reasons that people continue to be in a relationship after they break up, and again, looking at how those dark personality traits, that willingness to exploit, is associated with why you stay friends. And so I also looked at, to the extent to which people prioritize traits like honesty, humility, or the willingness to exploit when you're looking for a partner. I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with the work by David Buss and many others, looking at, for example, sex differences in preference for physical attractiveness, for social status, financial resources. What we did in this study is we sought to replicate that using a different design, but we included a characteristic that I think is not often included when people are comparing, say, those traits, social status, financial resources, physical attractiveness, to trust. That is, how important is it to have a partner that is trustworthy, that is going to be a reliable cooperator. And what we found was that trust floats to the top. And in fact, if you include trust in profiles where they have to evaluate different traits in a partner, those sex differences disappear. People are loading all of their ability to choose on these trust traits, and so the sex differences disappear. So at the same time that I was doing this, I was also doing, again, studies on morphometric cues, the interest in things like sexual dimorphism of the face, how masculine or feminine an individual tends to appear, and its contribution to perceptions of attractiveness, masculinity, etc. And this was part of my PhD, and so I was doing it to fulfill the dissertation requirement. But one of the conclusions that I started to come to was that people are prioritizing, it seems, above cues of health, such as symmetry, or color cues of health, things like skin blood perfusion, how red the face tends to be. They're prioritizing these sexually dimorphic traits, these masculine or feminine qualities. Well, if we look at what motivates aggressive, exploitative behavior, the qualities that tend to be associated with this, sexually dimorphic traits are predicting, on average, those tendencies. And so we know that sexually dimorphic traits, masculine, feminine characteristics, are those which have conferred an advantage during sexual conflict, during intrasexual competition. So these are traits that perhaps people are paying attention to because they signal something about the ability to compete, or the ability to, say, coerce or exploit an individual. Some research has shown that masculinity, facial masculinity, is associated with kind of heightened preferences for dominance, being dominant, as well as lower ratings of suitability as a long-term mate. More recent work has looked at how masculine traits tend to be associated with, or they seem to be able to enable coercion and predatory behavior, things like emotional manipulation or success during competitive, that is, high inequality environments, and is related to aggression and violence. So I started in my own mind thinking, all right, if we're looking at when certain mating behaviors like mate poaching tend to be more exploitative, more aggressive, people are being harmed, maybe it's not that these strategies are universally harmful, but rather there are some people who are doing them in relatively more harmful ways. while I was doing all this, I was also studying consensual non-monogamy. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what consensual non-monogamy is, so it's abbreviated CNM, and I'm going to be calling that throughout this talk. It's when you and your partners agree to form multiple romantic or sexually intimate relationships, what we would otherwise call extra pair relationships, things like at the same, and everyone agrees to it. These examples would be polyamory, open relationships, swinging relationships. And this topic got me curious because if you look at most of EvPsych research, we're characterizing conflict, struggle, subterfuge, deception within relationships because there is this motive to, there is this motive shaped by sexual conflict to compete for mates. And so these are individuals who seem to be in relationships that otherwise are characterized as very conflictory within monogamy, and yet they seem to be making it work. They're happy. So how? How are they doing this? What that motivated me to do was just to start testing some very basic evolutionary psychological hypotheses within these samples, within consensually non-monogamous relationships. And so the earliest study I published on this was looking at the frequency of mate retention, for example. What we found is that both monogamous individuals and people in consensually non-monogamous relationships are engaging in mate retention. But if you break apart consensual non-monogamy and look at how people are engaging in mate retention with, for example, primary partners, those that they spend a lot of time with, they have shared goals, versus secondary partners, ones that they are incorporated into the relationship, but maybe there aren't as many shared goals or intent to continue on, they're engaging in more mate retention with primary partners than with secondary partners. So they seem to be distinguishing partners that perhaps, this is one interpretation, are relatively more valuable or that they would care to lose compared to others. We also found that individuals within these relationships didn't, they reported more communication in general than people in monogamous relationships, but they were just as satisfied as individuals within monogamous relationships. We also, in a separate study, looked at sex differences and jealousy. There's once again a very common, a well-documented phenomenon whereby men relative to women tend to be more upset by or more interested in their partner's sexual infidelities versus women compared to men are relatively more upset by emotional infidelity. Well, we tested this in a monogamous sample, we replicated that finding, but we also tested it in a consensually non-monogamous sample, and we didn't observe those sex differences. So there's something going on such that these relationships in many ways are similar to monogamous ones, but in some of the ways that we would traditionally predict them to differ in monogamous relationships, they're not differing in that way in consensually non-monogamous relationships. I also tested, one of the ideas that we were thinking is, well, once again, the source of conflict in monogamy can sometimes be related to perhaps the traits or the environmental characteristics that we would expect if people have unrestricted sociosexuality, things like fast life history. So in this study, we looked at whether individuals within consensually non-monogamous relationships are more likely to have fast life history traits, things like willingness to take risks, how often they avoid pathogens and disease or have a motivation to avoid pathogens. And what we found is that relative to monogamous individuals, they did have faster personality traits. They were more willing to take risk, and they did not avoid pathogens as often, and they had greater interest in short-term versus long-term relationships. So this is odd because they have these traits that we would normally expect would be associated with conflict. And yet in practice, if you look at the research in relationship science, sexuality science, who are documenting relationship outcomes within consensually non-monogamous relationships, they're still having satisfactory, high-quality relationships. They're still having outcomes that, despite perhaps having these traits, they are figuring out how to make it work. So this got me to think whether CNM, consensual non-monogamy, might in some way be a better or more secure strategy for pursuing a relationship with more than one individual at once. That is, if individuals they have these traits, maybe there's something about the practice of consensually non-monogamy that is inhibiting some of the negative outcomes you would normally observe. So if you're curious about what is happening in consensually non-monogamous relationships, so they're actually very similar to monogamous ones. Looking at the research, they tend to be demographically diverse, so people of all walks of life of different parts of society are in consensually non-monogamous relationships. Though there are some important differences. For example, people in CNM relationships tend to be more likely to be bisexual, have a non-binary gender. They're also more, tend to have a more unrestricted sociosexuality, meaning that they have a more favorable attitude towards casual sex and engaging in casual sex. But otherwise, more similarities than differences. They tend to pursue emotional and sexual intimacy. They form committed relationships. They experience passionate love. They have shared goals with partners. Again, everything you would expect in a monogamous relationship. They have sex for both sexual and relational fulfillment. They build families. And this is an underdeveloped area of research in my opinion, but there is evidence coming out that they build families, and they depending on how children are thought about in those families, those children can have comparable life outcomes to those in monogamous relationships. They engage in mate retention, so we know that they are, for example, valuing certain partners and then attempting to keep those partners if they deem them valuable. And they attempt to resolve conflict. Again, everything you'd expect in a monogamous relationship. But of course, there's an additional challenge. They have another partner. And what I would argue is, if we take consensual out of the definition, if we just take consensual out and we look at the challenges of non-monogamy, of having more than one partner at once, there are some unique things. This is quite tricky. There are some unique issues that need to be addressed. For example, if you have more than two individuals who are involved intimately with one another at the same time, you now have to worry about third parties, or there being an audience, right? So now any conflict that occurs in the relationship, you have a third person who maybe could act as a moderator, someone who helps resolve that conflict, but you could also be forming alliances such that two individuals could gang up on or treat unfairly someone else. And I think that if looking at this from an EvPsych perspective, I think a really good model for understanding how alliances and third parties matter is work by Kurzban and colleagues, looking at, again, they do an excellent job of I think, characterizing the moral concerns that arise when you have a third party or more. So I think alliance formation is a unique problem that individuals within non-monogamous relationships broadly have to consider. There's also an argument that there might be greater intra-sexual competition, such that, well, if you're in a monogamous relationship and you are truly not having relationships with other people outside of a pair bond, there presumably is less competition. You're not on the mating market anymore. And if you're not actively in the mating market, you won't have pressure from outside from, for example, poachers and people who would be interested in perhaps gaining access to your partner. And indeed, what we see is that there is greater intersexual competition and mate guarding with people that one's partner finds attractive. So if there's someone around who your partner finds attractive, you tend to act more competitively, you tend to engage in more mate retention, presumably to preserve that relationship. And this is particularly true if partners are mismatched on attractiveness. That is, if you are less attractive than your current partner and they are entertaining someone else, you should be very cautious to, you should be guarding your mate or trying to compete in some way. And there's also the risk of, there's some risks associated with having unrestricted sociosexuality. If you look in the general population, people who report a more unrestricted or a greater interest in casual sex do tend to report more self-perceived pathogen risk. So that is, they are exposing them, they're getting into situations where they might be more likely to contract a sexually transmitted infection, for example. And they tend to report fewer safe sex practices compared to people who are more restricted. Again, though, I want to emphasize that this is for people who generally are being more non-monogamous or being more unrestricted. If you look at CNM relationships, there's evidence showing that these individuals are no more likely to expose themselves to pathogens or to engage in fewer safe sex practices. So again, we need to distinguish between non-monogamy that is more consensual versus broadly just non-monogamy. So what do I think is going on here? Let's imagine, so why might consensually non-monogamous relationships in general, why might that be more complicated to manage than to manage monogamy? Let's imagine that you have a pair, all right? These are gender neutral individuals. I'm not even talking about gender or sex yet, but we have a self and they are in a relationship with a partner. So we could say that this is the in-pair relationship. If we look at what those individuals have to coordinate, what problems they need to solve, they need to figure out how to satisfy each other's relational motives. They might have an interest in reproduction, having offspring together, sharing resources, having a satisfying experience, and of course, coordinating social status, because the person that you are in a relationship with can sometimes reflect on your own status. And so that's what you need to manage. You bring in a third person, this introduces some problems that you might not otherwise have. So in the CNM relationship science, they refer to this individual as a metamor. Again, this is just someone who would be an extra pair partner, someone outside of the pair bond. Well, if we have this individual now, and they are in a relationship with you, now what you have to do is also satisfy the relational motives between the self and this metamor. And if you're trying to satisfy these motives here and here, what that can cause is for these individuals to now be in conflict, for there to be competition between them. And that competition varies in intensity, right? This could be, deception, lying. It can include physical violence or other types of harmful competition with one another. There might be reputational damage, perhaps through gossip, attempting to perhaps weaken the relationship between these individuals. And there's always the ever-present threat of potential mate poaching or mate switching, such that perhaps you end up being a better match with the metamor than with your current partner, and so perhaps you jettison or get rid of this partner, and now this is the primary bond. That's a threat. So there's competition there, but it gets more complicated because there is a world where perhaps the metamor and your partner get into a relationship. And if that's the case, well, now there's going to be competition potentially between yourself and the metamor, adding another variable that you need to account for. And if they have this relationship, there could now be competition between you and your partner. So what you're doing is you're adding these extra layers of needing to fulfill relationship motives, but also having to address potential conflict that arises when people are trying to share their time and resources with one another. I think the other thing that you must account for is that each of these individuals is not a copy of one another. They each have their own personalities, their own interests, and so you have to account for, this is not a comprehensive list, but how willing someone is to exploit their interest in casual sex and whether that's matched to another partner, perhaps their attachment in terms of attachment theory, their social dominance and interest in hierarchy and whether some people have better access to resources than others, and mate value. I think mate value is a big thing. What happens when, for example, this partner is substantially or at least somewhat more physically attractive than this one? And we can say that each person has their own personality. And we also have to consider that this is in some ways also there's a fourth relationship here. There's a meta relationship, a relationship that emerges because these three individuals are now interacting with each other. And they have to consider, say, how is disease, pathogens, sexually transmitted infections, how are they passing among individuals? Sex ratio can matter because as much as these personality traits differ between people, it also depends on whether these individuals are men or women, right? So the dynamic of one male with two women might be very different than, say, the dynamic between three women, or the dynamic between a woman and a male partner and a woman and a female partner, etc. And then, like I said, you also have to worry about hierarchy or alliances forming. So my point here is I think that there is a legitimate argument to be made that non-monogamy is more complex. There are other variables that need to be taken into account above and beyond the normal concerns that you would have in any relationship within a pair bond. Okay. So I think relationship conflict, the potential for relationship conflict is a big part of why we see things like mate poaching, like having a relationship with multiple individuals at once as relatively more immoral, or there's something that we should be avoiding. These are relationships or behaviors that we should be avoiding. One of a recent publication that actually came out this year that I did with some of my students was looking at people's reasons for experiencing apprehension towards CNM or concern. What kinds of things do you worry about in a non-monogamous relationship? And we created a measure of apprehension, of worry towards CNM, where we asked individuals to nominate different concerns, things that they would be worried about if they were to get into a consensually non-monogamous relationship. And then we performed, we had a second sample where we were able to perform factor analysis and identify different types of concern. There were 5 that we identified. The big one was anticipated relationship conflict. There was also people didn't want to violate their moral beliefs about what's right and wrong. They were concerned about potential reputational damage if, say, their family, their friends, their employers knew that they were in a non-monogamous relationship, sexual health risk, and funnily enough, also same-sex intimacy, which is a fair point, because if you are in a relationship between two people and it's opposite sex, if you add another person and they are of a particular sex or gender, someone may be having kind of same-sex attraction or satisfying same-sex attraction there. But the big thing that came out was anticipated relationship conflict. So when we looked at the amount of variance explained within this scale, anticipated relationship conflict was by and far the factor that explained the most variance. And so it seems to be this conflict, this expected conflict, that perhaps is driving concern about consensual non-monogamy. If you're interested in this paper, of course, you can access it here, but there are some other associations, interesting associations that we observed with personality, but I'm not going to go over those right now. Okay, so this conflict exists. How is it resolved? If you do not resolve this conflict, presumably it will lead to a relationship ending, it will lead to potential harm, undesirable outcomes. And so if multi-partnering, if having multiple intimate relationships increases the risk of relationship conflict, how can this be prevented? I think the traditional argument is that's why monogamy is so popular. Monogamy, if you adhere to monogamy strictly, you are not forming these extra pair relationships, you don't have to worry about these problems, right? You are not you're not putting yourself in a situation where you have to deal with that. And I think the person who makes some of the most potent arguments is Joseph Henricks at Harvard, where he lays out why might monogamy have caught on and spread so readily, especially within Western populations, and the various issues that it resolves. Though there are also those who make the argument that so the argument that Henricks makes is that monogamy really led to the development, or it really enhanced cooperation. But there are some who argue that monogamy and cooperation are actually developed independently, and that any association that we observe between monogamy and cooperation is more incidental or due to other factors. So that's a potential solution, is just restrict your interaction with extra pair partners. If you just restrict that, if you don't put yourself in that situation, you don't have to worry about the problem. There is another solution. You could commit infidelity. Infidelity is a solution to the problem of multi-partnering. And this is an argument that I make in a chapter that I published in a handbook recently that's coming out actually next year. The argument being that infidelity is really kind of an ingenious strategy for doing something very selfish, for satisfying your own interest, resolving the problem of multi-partnering. Because what you're doing is you are convincing your partner to be monogamous with you, that you are going to restrict your extra pair interactions, they are going to restrict their extra pair interactions, but geniusly, you deceptively, without letting them know, continue to have extra pair relationships. What that does is it allows you to gain all the benefits of having an extra pair partner, but it also causes your partner to restrict their extra pair behavior. So you've solved two problems. You now have access to more partners, and you're making sure that you don't lose them, or you don't, they don't expose themselves, or say they're a woman, they don't get pregnant, you don't potentially get cuckolded, for example. So infidelity actually is an ingenious solution, but it tends to be harmful. It causes many issues, and there's a fairly large literature on the negative relationship outcomes of infidelity. An alternative is that perhaps there are certain practices that people who who get into intimate relationships with multiple individuals, maybe there are certain practices that they're engaging in that reduce conflict. So rather than avoid extra pair relationships, do something to prevent the conflict, the damage to relationship quality that arises because of multi-partnering, of having multiple relationships. I think at this point in my thinking, what I've come to realize is I think it's important to taxonomize or think about the different types of multi-partnering more broadly. I mostly have focused on consensual non-monogamy, but I think that there are many ways of managing multiple relationships at once. This is an encyclopedia entry that's forthcoming. It's not yet published. This is the proof, so you're getting the first look here. Where I define what multi-partnering is broadly, that is just being in a romantic, sexual, or otherwise intimate relationship with more than one person. But I go through and I describe the different ways of accomplishing that, such as through plural marriage, right? And as I go through these different types, I describe what do individuals within these relationships do to resolve some of these recurrent challenges that arise from multi-partnering. With plural marriage, these tend to be fairly more traditionally arranged marriages. They are usually dictated by local cultural or religious customs. And so what you're seeing here is that there are very strong norms that might prevent, for example, cuckoldry if men are allowed to have multiple wives, but women are not allowed to form relationships outside of their pair bond to the man. And so those are some of the strategies that ways in which plural marriage might resolve the challenges of multi-partnering. Sex work is, I think, in many cases, so sex work by default is not something that requires multiple partners, but you are going to be more likely to encounter multiple intimate relationships. And if you look at the best practices for sex work, it involves practices that reduce reliable use of contraception, of sexual health practices, of getting tested for sexually transmitted infections regularly, of creating a safe space for people to engage in sex without conflict arising between individuals involved in that. I would argue that casual dating and friends with benefits can be a type of multi-partnering. If you are casually dating multiple people at once, that is, you go on a date with one person, you go on a date with another person, and you continue to date them casually over a period of time, what you're doing is you are in a relationship with multiple people, at least for some amount of time. That is also a way to resolve it. Virtual intimacy, I think, is something we have to think about now. People are forming relationships not in person, but over online or through apps. For example, you can go on Discord and find plenty of online groups where people anonymously get together. They have sexual intimate interactions, and then they just kind of go their own way. And that's a certain way of resolving the challenges of multi-partnering, in that you aren't necessarily engaging physically with the person, which prevents some certain problems, such as some of the issues with actual physical engagement. I include infidelity, which I've already talked about here, and then I talk about consensual non-monogamy as well in the chapter. So I think it's important to distinguish these. But I focus on consensual non-monogamy because of each of these practices, I would argue that they have people who are in consensually non-monogamous relationships have some of the most well-developed, most thought-out solutions for resolving conflict caused by multi-partnering. That is, people in CNM relationships appear to make it work. And what I've cited up here are studies that continue to come out showing that relationship satisfaction quality is either as good as quality within monogamous relationships, or in some cases better than. For example, the study by, do I have it up here? I do not. One of Amy Muse's studies looking at people who prospectively opened up their relationship. So this is an odd study because they were able to identify almost 200 people who knew that they were going to be opening up their relationship. And so they were able to get relationship quality measures before they opened the relationship and relationship quality measures after. And what they found was that overall there were not many differences before and after opening the relationship, but sexual satisfaction tended to increase for people who did open their relationship. So they're doing something here to address this. And here's I think the argument that I'm trying to make is, if there are certain adaptive challenges that non-monogamy introduces, perhaps people in CNM relationships are developing strategies for resolving those challenges. And I think that evolutionary theory and a lot of the research that we've traditionally done on romantic relationships points towards the kinds of adaptive challenges that we might expect need to be resolved. For example, partner abandonment and resource diversion, right? Feeling jealousy in reaction to a partner's interactions with others could be very rational, because maybe you will lose the resources, the commitment, the things that you have been traditionally getting from that in-pair relationship. People in consensually non-monogamous relationships tend to resolve this challenge through a fair amount of communication, affect regulation, so regulating the emotional reaction that you have to your partner interacting with someone else. They also develop an emotion that is termed within, I think, popular and also research literature at this point, called compersion. And compersion is, rather than respond to your partner's extra-pair relationships with this negative, possessive anxiety, respond to it with being happy that your partner has this relationship, seeing the positive qualities of their interactions with someone else, and enjoying that. Another set of risks that you have to overcome is, again, pregnancy and pathogen transmission. Arguably, pregnancy is a type of pathogen transmission, right? You are becoming pregnant with someone else's biological material. Cuckoldry is an issue. You need to resolve. You need to resolve that cuckoldry. You need to prevent or reduce the harm caused by perhaps contracting an STI. And so, people in consensually non-monogamous relationships tend to be very good, particularly those who are in polyamorous relationships, tend to be very good at engaging in different safe sex practices and establishing relationship boundaries, understanding what's acceptable, what's not, what's going to be safe, what's not, to prevent these outcomes. I would argue that zero-sum partner rivalry is a problem. Zero-sum meaning that in any interaction there's going to be a winner and a loser. So if you win, I must lose. I think a lot of competition happens this way. And in relationships, a zero-sum outcome might be that you lose your relationship and your partner gains a better relationship with someone else. So rivalry is something that needs to be addressed. I think this study is one of the best examples of how to potentially resolve this challenge. This was actually a researcher working with polygamous families in Bedouin Arab societies, and what they were noticing within these societies, plural marriage was formalized, and they found that children on average were tending to have worse educational outcomes, in part because the men perhaps were not investing as much effort into taking care of the children compared to finding more partners, more wives to get into a relationship with. And one of the interventions that this researcher introduced was, well, what if we can convince the women within these relationships to ally with one another, to put pressure on the husband to give more resources, more time, and invested into the children compared to when these women were in conflict with one another. So perhaps trying to create stable or supportive friendships between who would otherwise be rivals could be a way to address some of the negative issues associated with rivalry. Status loss is another issue. Status is very important for humans. We have access to resources based on the status that we have, and if being in a CNM relationship tends to hurt your status, you might want to do something to alleviate that. And what you do tend to see is that there is a lot of secrecy within CNM relationships, or people withhold that information from their family, from their friends, and when they do that, compared to those who are not secretive about it, who feel that they can share that information, those who are more secretive tend to report lower relationship quality. So people are coping with this challenge through secrecy, but perhaps the better way to do it is to allow them to express this relationship preference, so that they are in this type of relationship, and maybe establish social support rather than making people feel alone, and that they have these preferences, and that they should feel bad for it. And then I would also argue that, again, there are these moral or group coordination concerns. You have more than two individuals, that gives rise to the potential for hierarchy, figuring out how resources tend to be managed among these relationships, including childcare, for example. All right, so here's the summary argument. I think that CNM and other multi-partnering practices, broadly speaking, are alternative strategies for resolving the adaptive challenges of multi-partnering. That is, these are different strategies for, if you run into issues practicing non-monogamy, how do you solve that? One way to solve it is through infidelity. Another way is to establish these traditions that govern polygamous, traditionally plural marriage relationships, and that each produces distinct relationship quality outcomes. Well, okay, to make this argument, I clearly need data. So let's finally dig into some data that I've been collecting in an international project, looking at and trying to identify what strategies are people in CNM relationships using to improve their relationship quality, to decrease levels of conflict, and perhaps for improving their personal health and well-being, their relationship health. So this was a grant-funded international project studying individual differences. We're trying to understand how people differ in how they regulate their and their partner's extra-pair romances, intimacies. We have data, so we have collaborators from several different countries. And again, our goal was to comprehensively identify and measure the strategies that people use to navigate consensual non-monogamy, manage its conflicts, and potentially to reduce the harm that you would expect from having multiple partners. If you're interested in what the pre-registered hypotheses for this project were, there were many of them. We are still working through them. Now that we have the data, there's tons to go through. If you're interested, they are all right here. They're uploaded to the Open Science Framework, OSF. Broadly, though, what we predicted is that first we would document the strategies that do resolve the recurrent challenges of multi-partnering. We expected that these strategies would be more common among those who practice CNM versus those in monogamous relationships. we thought that adherence, that is actually engaging in these behaviors, would be associated with greater relationship quality, particularly within multi-partner relationships. And then that, as another hypothesis, we thought that these strategies would improve relationship quality by reducing infidelity. If infidelity is really you are engaging in extra-pair romance, you are engaging in a relationship with someone else, and then you are deceiving your partner otherwise, your partner thinks that you're being monogamous, but you are doing otherwise, the defining feature of that of infidelity then is really deception. And so perhaps doing whatever people in C&M relationships are doing, perhaps that does improve relationship quality by taking out the risk of deception, of lying to your partner about the relationships that you're in with other people. All right, so what did we do? So in study one, we collected, first we needed to just identify what these strategies were, get a list of them. In study one, we recruited 429 individuals, largely via social media, that is targeting groups that are frequented by people in consensually non-monogamous relationships, things like polyamory subreddits, non-monogamy subreddits on Reddit, Facebook groups that are dedicated to consensual non-monogamy, as well as Twitter as well, and through co-authors' personal networks. And what we asked individuals within this study is an open-ended question. What are, in your opinions, some of the best and the worst practices for resolving conflict within a consensually non-monogamous relationship? This is considered what's popularly known as an ACT nomination procedure. You are asking people to nominate different items, kind of crowdsourcing this information from people. But we didn't exclusively rely on that. In fact, we had a priori predictions as well. We thought beforehand, given the challenges that need to be overcome, we can make predictions about what types of strategies will likely be successful. And so we had a list of a priori strategies as well, and we solicited more from the sample. If you look at the demographics, it's actually, I really like the spread of demographics that we got in this sample. So this is not a college-age sample, and it's not exclusively a Western sample either. So the age was about 37, some variability in there. There was a pretty good split, at least in the first set between men and women, as well as cross-gendered types. We had a fairly higher, I would say, relative to average representation of non-binary, genderqueer, trans, and other gender categories. People within this sample were largely polyamorous. There were some people in open relationships, swinging relationships, and some people who were monogamous but said, yeah, I could tell you what I think is the best and worst practice. And then some people who were single as well. And in terms of world region, we had 62% from the United States, 24.4% from Europe, 7.5% from Asia, and then some smaller percentages from other parts of the world. What did we do? Once we gathered these ACT nominations, we then tried to hybridize. We tried to combine the a priori predicted strategies with those that were identified by participants. And what we did to do that was we asked 4 independent sorters, people who were not familiar with our hypotheses. They were, I believe these were graduate students of one of the co-authors. What they did was they were provided with the a priori categories that we had identified, and then they were asked to sort the nominations from this study one data into each of those categories. And they were also asked to put anything that didn't fit into those categories in an uncategorized column. So things that did not cleanly fit into those categories. Once we had that, we then were able to revise the factors that we believed exist. We revised this a priori set of strategies, and then they were asked to resort these strategies once again, hopefully to account for the strategies that were uncategorized. And once we did this the second time, we had far fewer acts that were considered uncategorized. So this was an attempt to capture, to explain, to label these ACT-nominated procedures, or ACT-nominated strategies. We revised it once again after this, and this led to what I affectionately call the multi-partner relationship maintenance scale, which I will abbreviate as the MRMS. This is our measure that we've developed of individual differences in adherence to each of the practices that we identified. What people were asked to do is, these were the instructions. So below is a series of statements. Please rate how well each statement generally describes you. 1 being, it doesn't describe me very well at all. 7 being, it describes me extremely well. And they were able to complete this both about themselves generally, and how generally they engage in these behaviors, but also how often do they engage in these behaviors with a particular partner. So we had partner evaluations as well. So what were the strategies that we identified and that made up this scale? So if anyone's interested in how you maintain a consensually non-monogamous relationship, here you go. All right, the first factor that we at least hypothesized, this is before we had data to confirm that this was this was indeed the strategy. First, what we labeled as exclusivity agreement. That is, near the start of a relationship, do you speak with your partners about whether you may have sexual or romantic interactions with other people, and then throughout the relationship discussing whether you may have these interactions, and reverse coded how often do you avoid it. You assume, I think, that people talk about this in their relationships, but that's actually a pretty big assumption. I think most people, especially those in monogamous relationships, don't explicitly talk about what's acceptable or not. They just assume. So you can do that. Number 2 is attraction disclosure. This is disclosing to your partner that you have attractions to other people. So do you talk with your partner about your attractions to other people? Do you tell your partner about intimate or flirtatious interactions that you have? And when you have these experiences, do you tend to hide or minimize them? Reverse coded, of course. Compersion we also measured. So we operationalized this as, I would enjoy it if my partners were having sex with other people. I would enjoy it if my partners were romantically intimate with someone else, or the thought of my partner having sex with someone else arouses me. Again, getting at those positive experiences that you have by your partner being involved with someone else. We measured jealousy regulation by asking them, whether they and their partner share and discuss experiences of jealousy, how openly they feel they can talk about jealousy, and whether they communicate well about jealousy. Partner hierarchy. This evaluates whether you tend to give some partners greater priority in your life. That is, do you give some romantic or sexual partners greater priority? I give some romantic or sexual partners more influence over my life decisions, as well as whether you avoid treating romantic or sexual partners partners as superior. So looking at how people tend to think about the hierarchy of their relationships. Sexual health maintenance, whether they use safer sex tools, condoms, hormonal birth control to avoid unwanted sexual outcomes, whether they would get tested if there's a chance that they had contracted a sexually transmitted infection, and their willingness to have unprotected sex with a partner, even if it were not clear that they would get an infection or not, or if an unwanted pregnancy would occur. Shared extra-pair sexuality. So this is when you are involved with an extra-pair partner, do you involve your in-pair partner in those interactions? So that is, I would prefer to involve my current partner in my sexual interactions with other people. I tell my sexual fantasies to my partner. My sexual fantasies about other people include my partner, or not. Childcare willingness. One of the challenges that needs to be overcome is, how do you manage resources, figure out how childcare is distributed. So we asked, how willing would you be to help your partner care for their children? How able you would feel to treat your partner's children as if they were your own. And just in case anyone's curious, we did ask whether people had children, and also whether their children were biologically related to their partner or not. So we were able to distinguish that. Reputation management. That is, whether you tend to talk about your current partners around people that you potentially find attractive, whether you tend to hide your involvement with your partners from other people, and whether you feel that you can openly talk about your relationships with other people. or not. And then also resource distribution. So another, again, issue that needs to be overcome is how are different partners going to have access to what is afforded by each of the relationships that you have. So I think about how satisfied my partners are with the amount of effort and attention I give them. I consider how fairly I share material resources, money, food, shelter with my partners. I often think about how much time I spend with my partners. So we identified these 10, and we then collected a separate sample in study 2, and we wanted to evaluate 3 different research questions. One, first, is the MRMS valid? And we did this through exploratory and confirmatory factor analyses. That is, we simply wanted to know, is this capturing, first off, is this a measure that reliably evaluates individual differences in how often people engage in these behaviors? But also we wanted to compare how often people in monogamous and CNM relationships scored, or how they scored on this measure, and whether there were differences between them. Because presumably, if this is assessing multi-partner relationships, people in multi-partner relationships should be more likely to engage in these behaviors. We also wanted to know whether scores on this measure were related to relationship quality. And what we did was we did this by performing hierarchical regressions on a series of outcome variables that we grouped based across 3 different surveys. So we recorded information about relationship satisfaction, how often they experience conflict in their relationship, as well as various indices of health and well-being. For the purposes of this talk, I'm only going to be focusing on the first one, satisfaction. This is the largest sample that we have, and so the others, we have that data, but I haven't quite documented it all yet, so I'm not comfortable sharing that. And then the third question we wanted to address is, are these practices related, if they are related to relationship quality, are they related through reduction of infidelity? Again, the argument that perhaps these practices are reducing how often people are dishonest about their extra-pair relationships, and we used mediation analysis to assess this. How did we recruit? It was very similar to the first study, except that, so we did a snowball sampling through project members' personal networks. We posted to social media frequented by people in CNM relationships. We also used promoted social media advertisement. And this is a really powerful way to collect data because, for example, you can pay Facebook, you can pay Twitter, you can pay Instagram to advertise a study, advertise the link to pretty much, you could choose, for example, anyone who is older than 18 years old within the entire United States, which is useful for getting a good community sample. But the other thing that I observed, and I put this in here just because it's interesting, it's kind of hard to see on here, it's a little clearer over on this slide, or on this screen here, is that when you start advertising and trying to recruit people for research on multi-partnering, you really start to see just, I think, how often people in CNM relationships get some unsolicited feedback on their relationship. Things like, STDs and jealousy, this presumption, are you nuts? Get thee behind me, Satan. And then this guy, which is kind of a thoughtful little comment, but still kind of harsh nonetheless. Call me old school, but you are complicit in and responsible for the downfall of the nuclear family. You gotta work harder if you wanna keep up with the rest of our institutions. Okay, I've gotta work harder, let's keep going. So, I gathered this data. So like I said, the first question is the MRMS valid? We first combined data, to perform the factor analyses, we first combined the data across all 3 of the surveys, and this gave us a sample of about 1,283 people. We did get demographic information for far fewer, and this is one of the challenges, I think, of studying a population that is relatively more stigmatized. They seem to be, my experience is that people are far less willing to provide personal information about themselves, even if you assure them that their info is private and confidential. The demographics were very similar to what we observed in the first study. 36 years of age, pretty good split in sex, distribution of gender types. We also looked at sexual orientation. a little less than half were heterosexual. We had a lot of representation of bisexual individuals, pansexual, those who identified their sexual orientation as queer, even though often that's used for gender. That was very common. The type of relationship they're in, poly, mono individuals, people in swinging relationships, people in open relationships, and then again, a good spread across different world regions. What were the results? So we first performed an exploratory factor analysis just to see whether we could find support for the strategies that we had identified. And if you've ever performed factor analysis, you know that it's a miracle to get more than just 2 or 3 factors at a time. I attribute what we found to, I'd like to think it's good planning. We actually found support for an 8-factor structure, which is, again, really quite surprising. But the loadings were a little bit messy. So the first several factors tended to have pretty high loading values. But as you get further on, these clustered a little bit more messily. And so what we did was we followed this up because we did have these a priori strategies. We did expect a certain factor structure to emerge. And so we also performed confirmatory factor analysis on the same sample. And we can talk about whether that's okay or not. The limitation here is that it's very difficult to get this kind of sample, and so we did not have another sample to separately run confirmatory factor analysis. But what we found is through confirmatory factor analysis, a 9-factor structure. So we were able to pick up one of the factors that we had lost. Again, though, it's important to notice that the first several, so attraction disclosure, telling your partner about your attractions to other people, jealousy regulation, childcare willingness, compersion, these, the alpha reliabilities were quite good for those. These others, not so much. So they did emerge, but arguably they're not as good of an indicator of variation in these qualities. Yet, despite that, we looked at fit statistics, and we performed fit analyses of fit in the overall sample between males and females within the sample, again determined by sex assigned at birth. Differences between monogamous and people in multi-partner relationships, people in North America versus Europe, because we didn't have a sufficient sample to compare outside of these 2 world regions, but we found fit for both of those, as well as people who are less than 39 and older than 40 years old. And remember that we collected MRMS data for both for the self, but also about each partner, and we found fit for each partner measure as well. We also looked at measurement invariance, and we tested invariance across gender, across the type of relationship, whether it's monogamous or multi-partnered, where they resided, so their country of residence, as well as age, and we observed acceptable standards for establishing variance. Okay, so we seem to show that, so this is showing that we're observing this factor structure. So what we felt then comfortable doing was now looking at those outcome variables, looking at things like relationship satisfaction. So now, are these practices related with relationship quality? We took the Survey 1 data, which had 528 people with demographic information. Again, a very similar set of demographics to the overall sample. And what we did was we got the demographics. We also asked them how much experience they have with each relationship type, being poly, swinging, open, or in a monogamous relationship. They indicated this on a scale from 1 to 7, either none or extensive experience. They filled out the MRMS about themselves, and then they also provided demographic information for their partner, completed the MRMS partner evaluation. We also asked them how often they feel, we measured their experience of infidelity within those relationships, and then we had each of our outcome measures that about evaluating satisfaction. Again, in this talk, I'm not going to be looking at these partner ratings at all. So how do we measure infidelity? Now, you'd probably think it's difficult because presumably people in monogamous and C&M relationships might define infidelity differently. So what we did was we asked 4 questions First, we asked everyone, what do you consider infidelity or cheating within your relationship? And this was an open-ended response, just to get people to think about what they would consider infidelity. We then asked them, how often do you, on a scale from 1, never, to 5, always, have interactions with other people that feel like infidelity? How often do you keep your sexual interactions with other people a secret from your partner? And then keep your emotional attachments with other people a secret from your partner. And we can discuss whether that's a good measure of infidelity or not. And then the outcome measures. How did we assess relationship satisfaction? We used the Perceived Relationship Quality Component Scale, which is a very popular measure of overall relationship quality. We looked at past and planned relationship investments. That is, how invested you tend to be in your how invested you have been in your partner, and how invested you plan to be in the near future. The new sexual satisfaction scale, which looks at, as you would guess, sexual satisfaction. We also used what are called the eroticism and nurturance scales, which look at the degree to which a relationship is defined by a kind of erotic elements, how sexual it tends to be, versus how nurturant it tends to be. Characterized by investment and mutual emotional support, etc. We looked at interdependence between partners, how interdependent they are within the relationships in terms of the resources that they share, whether they live together, etc. And then also something called the Sexual Communal Strength Scale, which looks at how often partners collaborate, they work together to achieve sexual satisfaction in their relationship. All right, so what are the results? Is this a valid measure of multi-partner relationship maintenance strategies? To assess this, we first collapsed across the different types of CNM, so poly, swinging, and open were all considered multi-partner. We then compared monogamous and multi-partnered individuals across each of the MRMS practices. And as we predicted, we found that people in multi-partner relationships were more likely to report attraction disclosure, greater jealousy regulation, more compersion, more shared extra-pair sexuality, more sexual health maintenance, and funnily enough, also more partner hierarchy, which I didn't expect. I expected more of that in monogamous relationships, but the data are what they are. Looking at the questions where we asked them, how much experience do you have in different types of CNM? So we could say how much experience they had in polyamory, open relationships, swing, and monogamy, and then looking at just running bivariate correlations between scores on the MRMS factors and their experience. And what we find is that as people have more experience with polyamory, open relationships, swinging, they report more attraction disclosure, more jealousy regulation, and funnily enough, monogamy was not associated with any of these. And if it was associated with these practices, it was negatively associated. So people in monogamous relationships were less likely to do these things. This was not, so the big three, the attraction disclosure, jealousy regulation, compersion were associated with all of them. The others were more inconsistently associated, which could mean that these relationships are defined by different levels of these practices, but these were also the measures that did not have as high of alpha reliability, so it may just be that there's a lot of noise in this. Do those who engage in these practices report higher relationship quality? Overall, there's a lot here, but overall they do. So if we look at especially those three that seem really important: attraction disclosure, jealousy regulation, to some degree compersion, it's related with higher relationship quality, more investment, more sexual satisfaction. But I think the important thing is that some of these are more related to investment quality than with sexual quality or with overall quality. So we are seeing some, I think, some important kind of distinct patterns here for each of the different MRMS practices. But we wanted to know whether these relationship quality differs, not just whether they're associated with these practices, but whether they're associated differently for people in multi-partner versus monogamous relationships. So what we did was we collapsed our outcome measures across three different categories. So to have an overall relationship quality, a measure of relationship investment, and also sexual relationship quality. So we had three outcomes that we created. And then we ran moderated hierarchical regressions comparing how these associations emerge for people in multi-partner versus monogamous relationships. So in step one, just looking at the main effects, we observed that these practices are associated with higher overall relationship quality, particularly jealousy regulation, traction disclosure, shared extrapair sexuality, resource distribution, and childcare willingness. Looking at investment quality, the same general pattern emerged, but we also saw compersion and hierarchy more directly related to investment quality than with overall quality. And for sexual relationship quality, we observed that shared extrapair sexuality and jealousy regulation were the only predictors of that. But in step two, looking at the interaction, overall, we found no interaction. There was only one factor that had an interaction between with relationship type, and that was attraction disclosure. And what we use simple slopes to tease this apart to figure out what's happening. It seems that people who are in multi-partner relationships, they report, if they report less attraction disclosure, they tend to report lower overall relationship quality. So it seems that attraction disclosure is almost having a protective factor, that when you are low on that trait, when you're low on that trait, you tend to be lower on overall quality. All right. Is the MRMS related to quality via this reduced infidelity? Again, testing the hypothesis that maybe these are addressing instances of infidelity. What we did was we averaged the scores on our three continuous infidelity measures, questions, and we then used three linear regressions testing first whether infidelity predicted the relationship outcomes. And indeed, this is just replicating previous research. It seems that infidelity, if you're engaging in relatively more infidelity, you report less overall relationship quality, less sexual relationship quality, though interestingly enough, not lower investment quality. So infidelity seems to be unrelated to the quality of investment in the relationship. Looking at bivariate correlations between each of these practices and instances of infidelity, yes, people who reported more infidelity reported less attraction disclosure, less jealousy regulation, less compersion, less extrapair sexuality, less sexual health maintenance, resource distribution, though more reputation management and more partner hierarchy. We might discuss why that is. And then to finish this all off, because we did establish the base associations that we presumed would be there. We then tested the mediation model, and we found support for it, partial support. So infidelity partially mediated the association between overall relationship quality and sexual relationship quality and each of these practices. But you should note that these are relatively small effect sizes. So there is something else going on here besides just resolving infidelity. And of course, this is all correlational, so we should avoid saying that this is causing it. So, is the MRMS a valid measure of what people in consensually non-monogamous relationships are doing to resolve conflict? Yes, it seems to be, though it needs to be improved. Again, some of the measures, some of the items that we identified didn't have, there was a lot of noise in these measures, but again, this doesn't exist anywhere else, so as a start, I think it's quite good. Do those who engage in these practices report higher relationship quality? Overall, yes, but it depended on the practice. Some were better predictors than others. And it was true for both monogamous and multi-partner relationships. And then are these practices related to relationship quality via a reduction in infidelity? Yes, though only partially. So where do we go from this? If you're paying attention, close attention, you realize that this is all correlational. We can't conclude anything about causation from these data. For example, it could just be that people who are relatively higher on relationship quality tend to be doing these things. I think that's unlikely because we would then see that across monogamous and multi-partnered relationships that they are equally likely to do these things, but they're not. It's the people who are in multi-partner relationships who are, for example, disclosing attraction to their partner or engaging in a shared extrapair sexuality. But what we need to do is perform a longitudinal, ideally experimental, placebo-controlled study of whether and how these practices cause change in relationship quality. And I think this is a really important next step because this could potentially have important implications for things like relationship therapy if individuals are struggling with non-monogamy. Being able to say, hey, if you adopt this practice, it may improve your relationship quality, I think is important. It also has potential public health intervention value where if, again, non-monogamy contributes to certain public health issues, resolving conflict within non-monogamous relationships could improve public health. I think we also need to do dyadic analyses, right? We're just getting perspectives from one partner in this study, but as you know, one person's perception of a relationship can differ from their partners. And given that CNM relationships are comprised of multiple partners, we might want to do something like social relations modeling, where you can disentangle what are called actor effects and partner effects and interaction effects for each of the partners involved beyond just two people. So it's not always just dyadic, which is very complicated. We also need to, ideally, recruit people for in-person, especially physiological measures. In my research in my PhD and earlier, I did a lot of couples studies where we would recruit people, take pictures of their faces, record aspects of their body composition. And the idea is that there are certain physical traits that tend to be associated with relationship quality and processes within a relationship. And so I think it's important to be able to describe at a physiological level what's happening when partners are engaging in these relationships and maybe how that's related to their relationship quality. And then I also think that we need to consider these practices not as individual things that you can do to improve relationship quality, but rather that this might be part of a process. This is a very rough sketch, but this is how I'm starting to think about these practices. Is it might be that you don't just want to be disclosing your attraction to other people, because if you leave it at that, now your partner knows that you're attracted to someone else. They're now going to feel jealousy. That's going to open up a potential wound, something that's hard to deal with. And so from that, you might then progress into strategies for regulating jealousy. And I think that what sexual health maintenance, engaging in shared extrapair sexuality, negotiating hierarchy, considering how resources are distributed, are each strategies for attempting to regulate jealousy, to feel comfortable within that relationship. And doing these things, resolving jealousy, might contribute to that feeling of compersion or actually being happy, or at least accepting that your partner is in these relationships with other people, and that affects relationship quality. So I think it's important to look at the process as well. All right. So what's my conclusion here? Let's go back to mate poaching. My question was, well, can we have some kind of empathy for people who mate poach, in that there may be relatively more ethical or less ethical ways of mate poaching? And I think there potentially are, in as much as there are relatively more ethical or less ethical ways of pursuing non-monogamy, of having intimate relationships between multiple people. And I think the conclusion I have so far is that within the distribution of alternative mating strategies that exist within humans, some of those practices are going to reduce harm more effectively than others, produce better quality outcomes. We've identified 9 strategies by which people, I think, might be able to reduce how often suffering is caused by multi-partnering. And a bigger argument I want to make is that much of the evolutionary research, I think, focuses on sexual conflict and the ways in which, for example, men and women differ in their ideal mating strategies. But there is actually some really good work, especially in the more biologically focused animal research science, looking at birds, for example, of how birds might achieve some level not just of sexual conflict, but of sexual cooperation. And I think maybe you could do that within humans as well. That is, through some of these practices, might men and women, rather than be at odds in how they pursue relationships, could they coordinate their preferred mating strategies to collaboratively maximize the kind of desirable relationship outcomes they're looking for. I would say that if desire for partner variety is a ubiquitous feature of human mating, and I think there's pretty good evidence of that, maybe what we could do is rather than to address that conflict, rather than uniformly expect people to engage in abstinence from extra-pair relationships, that is, engage in monogamy, avoid extra-pair relationships, why not do the same thing that we do with any other health concern or risky behavior, and that is identify and try to share safe practices for forming and maintaining multiple intimate relationships at once. All right. That's all that I have. So again, that's my name. You can find me at these places. I want to thank the University of South Carolina, who was the distributor of the grants funding this research. I want to thank my collaborators, and of course, the University of Sao Paulo, and of course, this conference, the co-op conference organizers as well. If you want the slides to this presentation, you can get them right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. Yeah, relationships are not easy, right? So, so suggestions, questions.
Thanks, Justin. I'm going to be to play devil's advocate here and be as deliberately provocative as I can be. We live in an age of tremendous, almost mind-boggling wealth inequality. So 1% of the population controls probably the majority of global wealth. So that, I think, is fact number one. Fact number two is that there are, the sex ratio is 50-50. There's one man, one woman. And fact number three is that socially imposed monogamy is evolutionarily novel, most likely, and might be kind of fragile. So given these facts, and then the fact, let's put in a fourth fact that you had in the beginning of your talk on mate preferences, we know that there's a female bias for resources. And so could we be looking at some of the initial stages of trying to break down socially imposed monogamy? And if we are, what would be the population consequences of that, given the tremendous wealth inequality and given the 50-50 sex ratio? What we would probably be heading back towards pretty quickly is that it's very much in the interest of rich, powerful men to be polygynous. And they are, and we have incredible numbers of, we have a large not a large population, but we have a lot of rich guys that would love to have multiple mates. So the population consequences here would be that we are going to move back to reproductive inequality, that wealth inequality will lead to tremendous reproductive skew, and we will end up with the rich guys having multiple wives, the poor guys not having access to women at all. And we've seen this in population after population. When there's not socially imposed monogamy and when there is tremendous wealth inequality, that's exactly what we see. The experiment been run several times, many, many times. So, and what we also see is those societies are highly patriarchal. So by breaking down socially imposed monogamy, could we be exacerbating inequality, strengthening patriarchy, and could what you be doing here is basically creating a manual for the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos and Leonardo DiCaprio's to kind of better manage their harems?
So I agree that those men could use these strategies perhaps to manage harems, but at the same time, I think women in those harems would have some amount of power, if educated, to know what they can do, how to improve their outcomes within that situation. Also put pressure on, in that case, the males. So I think part of this is not that these strategies are going to uniquely work for the wealthy, the powerful, but that it actually could potentially empower those who would be disenfranchised in that situation, whether those are women who have to compromise their preferences to satisfy the extra powerful men, or even the disenfranchised men who are not now getting mates.
How does it help those guys? How does it help the Homer Simpsons versus the Elon Musks here?
I think that you can identify. I'll say, for example, in a polygamous marriage situation, I talked about the Bedouin Arab societies. In those situations, the negative outcomes were not so much due to the non-monogamy itself, or having multiple intimate relationships, but rather that the man was treating or behaving in a way that was capitalizing on the women being at odds with one another, of being in these rivalrous circumstances. And so what you could do through educating about these types of practices is, I think, give those who are in the weaker position an understanding of what maybe those men are doing and how they are keeping them less empowered. And so it could allow the more disenfranchised to kind of, I don't want to say gang up, but form alliances or understand that they do have other options for putting pressure on those people. Because maybe if you can recognize that you are in a unpropitious situation because you're in a relationship with one guy who is being coercive, and you are aware of that and you know that there are solutions to it, you can then use those solutions to put yourself in a better situation, make him behave differently, or to seek out mateships with other people in a way that is will be less likely maybe to upset that male, etc.
How would that help Homer Simpson?
So we're focusing specifically on men, right? So males.
Yeah, the guys that are losing out. So the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks, and they have multiple mates. The poor guys have no mates, 50-50 sex ratio. Every guy that has 2 wives, another guy has no wife.
So
what do those guys do?
If we presume that we continue to live in democratic societies, and you can wield the power of many people to shape law, shape social policy, I could see a situation where the Homer Simpsons and many of the women who are disenfranchised, they shape society in such a way that they can have power. You can shape the social system to kind of create more advantageous situations for those individuals, given that polygamy exists.
Doesn't that lead us right back to monogamy? The Homer Simpsons get together and say the rule is going to be one guy, one wife.
Yeah. I would agree with that. So one solution would be monogamy.
Right.
But there could also be a separate strategy by which people create an alternative to monogamy that is still addressing all the issues that you're talking about, but does not require that people be monogamous with one another. So I think that monogamy is a very powerful tool. I think that it addresses a lot of potential issues. But I'm not convinced that it is the optimal way of reducing the harm that I think naturally arises when you see wealth inequality, when you see biased sex ratios, etc. I think those things are going to happen regardless. You're going to see multi-partnering regardless.
Yeah, we've got it regardless, I agree.
It's a matter of what you do about it. I think monogamy is one solution, but there may be another set of solutions to those problems. An alternative model where people continue to be able to have multiple relationships, but they still reduce that conflict. So I guess my answer to your question would be, it could lead back to monogamy. So it could lead back to monogamy. There might be disenfranchised individuals, but I think that we should be designing practices, strategies for helping those individuals to lead satisfying lives, despite the fact that there is maybe polygamy. I think polygamy, when it's going to happen regardless. It's what tools you equip people to deal with that situation. I think that's my argument anyway.
All right, we can talk more.
I'd love to.
More questions?
Hi, Justin. Thank you for your lecture. I would like to hear your thoughts on the relationship between these outcomes in CNMs and the willingness or the desire to have children in the short term, especially in relationships where there are multiple males and one or less females involved, because we know males always experience some kind of paternity uncertainty. So this might be engaged in a real problem when people want to have children in the short term. So your thoughts on that?
So the idea is that maybe women would have a harder time convincing those men to provide childcare because they know the threat of cuckoldry is right there?
Yeah.
And so how do you resolve that? I think so. One of the arguments that I've seen, I'm not the first to make this, is that you know, if you look at CNM relationships, when you use safe sex practices, when you wear a condom, when you prevent pregnancy, what you're doing is you are removing the actual threat of pregnancy by a certain partner. So using condoms would potentially reduce the anxiety, the jealousy that feeds into some of the conflict or unwillingness to invest that men experience by virtue of that jealousy. So I guess I would say that in those situations where you have conflict between men and that conflict is causing lower relationship quality, we need to have technological interventions that reduce would reduce the issue caused by that. So that is, if you're yeah, I hope that helps. Does that answer or address your question?
Yes, it addresses my question. I'm just a little bit skeptical about this positive outcome, especially when people desire to have children. Because I think, especially for males, it might be a really strong problem related to this paternity uncertainty.
So if it were all above board and you knew that your partner wanted to have a child, that she was in a relationship with multiple men, and you could be 100% certain that she is engaging in safe sexual practices to prevent pregnancy, and she's only getting pregnant by you, that would presumably resolve the concern, right? Versus, and you could negotiate this, right? Where you could say, you know, okay, I'm going to have one child by me, and I know that that's going to be my child, and there's going to be a child by someone else, and you use those reproductive technologies to get rid of the uncertainty.
Yeah, you reduce the uncertainty.
Yes, yeah.
For sure.
I think that's the key, yeah. Reducing uncertainty. Thank you.
Someone else? Yeah.
Hi. Okay, I'm wondering if you have any observations of patterns in age differences, especially those that are tied to menopause in women. So do you find that women who are maybe more agreeable to a CNM relationship with more women and fewer men might have less to lose, or some, I don't know. Do you see any patterns with that?
I think that's a good prediction. I mean, it's for the same reason that men might be more willing if they knew 100% of the time their partner was using safe sex practices. There's going to be no cuckoldry. As much as women might be more comfortable if there's not as much of risk of pregnancy, or kind of your life priorities have shifted such that, you know, the costs of your partner having another relationship are much lower, then you should be you should be maybe more willing to engage in, have more positive attitudes towards something like consensual non-monogamy.
And do you see any patterns of that in the types of relationships that are most common? The types of male to female ratios and ages?
It's a good question. I know that swingers tend to, for example, so if you distinguish between different types of CNM, which I think you'd need to do for that, swingers tend to be a little bit older sometimes, at least relative to other groups.
Both the men
I don't know of that exact data, but I think that is testable, and I'm trying to think whether I could test it right now with the data I have. I do have information about, you know, childcare investment, how children are related, and we have age, and we have a pretty good spread of age. So we have I forget how many people who are above 40. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
I think we have also the relationship duration, right? So we can see.
We
It
could,
might be
yes,
partly
yeah.
age, right, of the people, but also relationship duration.
Yeah, I think you do tend to see that as people go on in their relationship, they're a little more, if they're not already CNM, as relationship duration increases, they tend to be more accepting of more positive attitudes towards it. Yeah.
Last question.
So seeing the comments that you got, that remind me of a argument, I guess, can say that Jeffrey Miller did of a Christian CNM. So taking that Western society is largely Christian, you think it's possible to make something like that? Convince maybe those more conservative Christian people that CNM is a possibility?
It's funny because, you know, you see in particular like Christian BDSM groups popping up, and they kind of have their own iteration of kind of that you know, kink orientation. And so it's tough for Christianity because almost a defining feature of Christianity is monogamy and monogamous marriage. But I could see a world where you keep many of the same cultural practices of Christianity and yet change that one particular practice, and, you know, adopt if monogamy as a Christian practice is meant to protect the pair bond, it's meant to, you know, reduce this conflict, could you introduce some of these precautions as a way to be able to allow non-monogamy in a Christian tradition and yet still resolve the troubles that monogamy in that tradition is meant to resolve, if that makes sense?
Yeah,
So
makes
I think yes. In short, yes, I think that's possible. But I think that I think that people you know, have legitimate concerns to be worried about how being non-monogamous could affect their relationship. And I think it's really important to identify what those concerns are and find interventions for addressing those concerns. Because, you know, if you just throw caution to the wind, you could be putting yourself in a situation where your relationship is more likely to dissolve, or someone's going to get pregnant by someone that they didn't want to get pregnant by. I think those are concerns that need to be addressed. And I imagine Christian practices are meant to address those, but that doesn't mean that those are the only practices that would resolve it. And you could maybe modify something.
Right. I remember one comment was something like, "Oh, you're destroying the nuclear family," and Jeffrey Miller says, "No, you can still have a nuclear family, you can still take care of your children, but it's just not monogamous."
Right. I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah, this would be actually interesting to do this kind of study also in polygynous or polyandrous societies, right? When I was asking Turkish men where they can have actually multiple wives, right, officially, when I asked them why they are actually mostly having one wife, they were telling me, well, it's so problematic to have one, imagine two or more. Right?
Right. Yeah. Too much work.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you very much again for your talk, and I will give you this small present as a for you not to forget that you need to now learn how to do your own caipirinha at home.
Okay.
And thank you again. It was a very nice talk.